Hello, fellow duelists. Today I want to talk about the deck building rules of domain format. Not only discussing how they change Yu-Gi-Oh's gameplay, but also giving you advice on how to adapt to them. This is the first part of a two-part series where I talk about the domain rules, so be sure to check out the second part, where I talk about the increased player count.
If it's actually been released yet.
Since we'll be talking about the fundamentals of the whole format, this little series will be helpful for you, no matter who you are, from the freshest of beginners
To the most experienced of the duelists.
Let's all fly in and learn
together.
As you know, every domain format deck must have exactly 60 cards in the main deck, and up to 15 cards in the extra deck. This makes it
much
less likely for you to draw any specific card in your deck. From a modest 33.76% chance if you play 3 copies of a card in a 40-card deck, to a way smaller 8.33% chance. The consistency of the average deck goes down by a fair amount, even if you play a few cards that can search whatever you're looking for. Now, this may
sound
like a bad thing, but I would argue that lowering the consistency of every deck out there actually makes for a way more fun deck building experience. Most archetypes by themselves won't even have enough cards to fit a 60-card deck, so you'll have to experiment with different ways of filling up that space.
For example,
You could add in lots of interaction to your deck, to slow down your opponents, letting you naturally draw into your most important cards over the course of a duel. Or you could include more engines in your deck, giving you extra versatility while still increasing your chances to make meaningful plays.
especially if you have a way to bridge those different strategies together.
This also means you won't always end up doing the same thing every time you play with a deck. You could play
dozens
of duels with the same 4 decks facing each other, and because your deck is less over-centralized on the same few cards, those duels will all feel unique.
Especially if you throw in a few silly cards here or there.
I should also note that recycling effects become quite valuable in the main format, since you're not allowed to play any duplicates. If you want to redo a combo, or recover an important card, you'll have to find a way to recycle them. Since we talked about consistency earlier, I have to tell you one way to make your deck incredibly consistent. It's one of the most exciting and game-changing parts of the format.
your deck master.
Every domain deck has to choose a monster to start out in their own special zone at the start of every duel. That monster can come out onto the field through the usual summoning methods, and if it ever gets into any danger, you can return it to the deck master zone to play it again later, at the cost of an incremental life point fee. The power to always have access to any monster you could possibly want is immensely powerful. You could choose a monster that single-handedly starts off your deck's plays, so you'll never have to worry about consistency. This is what we call a starter deck master. And don't get me wrong, they are
Really
good. And I don't blame anyone for immediately choosing one of them when building a new deck. But they aren't the only kind of deck master you can use, and they're not flawless. You see, starter deck masters are usually very vulnerable. Most of them take up your normal summon, and if your deck relies on them too much, you will be in trouble if they get negated. That's why you should try to build your decks in a way where your deck master is important to your strategy, but not extremely vital to it. One way to accomplish that is to use a deck master that doesn't directly tie into what your deck is about,
But helps you out in a different way.
If your deck is built to control the field and win a battle of attrition, using a deck master that can deal huge damage to your opponents will make sure you'll always have a way to close out the duel before everyone else can fight back. Or maybe your deck is all about being aggressive, but you need a way to deal with back row. Your deck master could be a solution. This is usually called a counterweight deck master, and they show off one of the main appeals of the deck master mechanic.
they enable your creativity.
No matter what goofy or unconventional idea you want to try out, there will always be a deck master out there that can turn it into a cohesive strategy. And since the deck masters are always shown off to everyone at the start of a duel, using an uncommon one will make your opponents have to guess what kind of deck you're playing. while running a very well-known deck master will make it easier to tell what you're up to. Though, one thing I should mention. If your deck master is part of a really powerful archetype, or just so happens to be a stun card, don't expect the other players to cooperate with you a whole lot. But because this mechanic is so powerful, they're balanced out by a restriction. The kinds of monsters you can play in your deck are determined by what deck master you're using. You can only include monsters that belong to your deck master's domain, and that can really restrict your options. But, this restriction is the final key to what makes domain deck building so fun. Being limited in what monsters you can play encourages you to look deep into the card pool, find cards you've never seen before, and figure out how to make your deck function with what tools you have. My best advice is to search for all the monsters you're able to play, and just take your time looking through them.
You'd be surprised at how many cool cards exist out there, just waiting to be used someday.
If you're struggling to create a deck in this format, one easy way to build around a domain is to focus on your deck master's attribute or type, using their associated support cards and whatever monsters you like.
The domain restriction also adds a lot of depth to choosing your deck master.
Most of them only have one type, attribute, and maybe one archetype. But there's a few deck masters that have a wide domain, and that adds even more ways for a deck master to be useful.
Think about it.
If I want to play an archetype that only has dark monsters, should I choose one of those cards to be my deck master, or a monster that gives me access to both light and dark monsters? There's no right answer to that, and that's the kind of choice I adore. If your deck really needs to play all the attributes out there,
or if you can't resist playing every hand trap that exists,
you can also play one of the 3 deck masters that give you access to every monster in the game. Though I wouldn't recommend using them in a majority of decks, since they're not that useful outside of removing the domain restriction. When you start a domain duel, you should always look at your opponent's deck masters, and keep in mind what their domains are. Knowing what monsters they can and can't play will guide you on what you should play around. It's way safer to combo off when you know none of your opponents can play Nibiru, for example.
Oh, almost forgot to mention this.
The Egyptian god cards can be played in any deck, regardless of your deck master. They're not exactly the greatest cards out there, but it's nice to keep them in mind in case your deck needs a big boss monster. Anyway, before I finish this video, I should mention that domain format doesn't have a ban list. You can play any card under the sun, no matter how crazy it is, and that has scared some people off before, but they're balanced out by the higher amount of opponents. And that's gonna be an important topic for the second part of this little series. Until then, I'll see you next time, duelists.